Welcome to Watchman Tales, where we bring you the darkest mysteries and chilling stories from around the world. Tonight, prepare yourself for 14 terrifying tales that will keep you awake long after the lights go out. The Chronos Casket. The small museum in coastal Maine was, by all accounts, unremarkable. It housed local history, old fishing gear, sepia photographs, the obligatory antique doll collection that always looked faintly menacing. But in a locked subterranean vault, accessible only to the chief curator, rested an object known simply as the Chronos Casket. It wasn't beautiful. It was a heavy, cube-shaped box, crudely fashioned from a dark, non-reflective metal that felt unnaturally cold to the touch. Its surface was engraved with swirling, non-Euclidean patterns that seemed to shift and writhe if you stared too long. The legend, whispered only among a select group of antiquarians and parapsychologists, was that the casket didn't hold treasure, it held time. Dr. Elias Thorne, a man whose career was built on debunking the supernatural, scoffed at the lore. He had been granted exclusive access to the casket for a month, his mission to scientifically prove it was nothing more than an oddly shaped lump of iron-nickel alloy. His initial tests were boringly conclusive. The metal was old, dense, and exhibited no unusual magnetic or radiative properties. The strange occurrences began subtly. Elias noticed his wristwatch was consistently a minute or two fast. His phone clock drifted out of sync with the world. He'd open a book to a page he knew he'd just read, only to find the chapter was different, the narrative subtly altered. He dismissed it as stress, the long, isolated hours in the museum's claustrophobic vault playing tricks on his mind. Then came the sounds, a low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that echoed from the casket, not loud but insistent, like a gigantic, slow-beating heart. One evening, as the local clock tower chimed 8, Elias swore he heard the chimes repeat immediately, a faint, ghostly echo exactly 1 second later. He recorded the sound, but his microphone picked up nothing. He started developing a terrifying sense of déjà vu, but inverted. He would know what was about to happen next. He'd reach through a coffee cup, and his mind would flash with the image of his hand knocking it over a moment later. He'd hear a specific line of dialogue from the security guard before the guard even opened his mouth. It was as if his consciousness was subtly gliding ahead of the timeline, experiencing the future before it became the present. The real horror began when he decided to photograph the casket with a high-speed camera. He set the timer, stepped back, and the flash illuminated the dark vault. When he developed the film, the image showed the casket perfectly, but just behind it, a faint, blurry shape, a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to be constructed not of flesh, but of shimmering, fractured light, like a being made of pure, unstable time. Its head was tipped back in what looked like a silent scream. He ran the photograph through numerous filters, convinced it was an artifact of the film process. But the figure remained, its outline sharper with every attempt to digitally erase it. The following night, the casket's coldness intensified. The air around it dropped several degrees, forming a faint, ethereal frost on the metal shelf it rested on. The rhythmic thump was louder now, and he felt it resonate not just in his ears, but in his chest. He had the urge, a compulsion to open it. The casket had no hinges, no seams, no visible lock. But as he reached out, his mind screaming in a silent panic, he saw it. A small, almost invisible indentation on one side, shaped like a tiny, abstract keyhole. As his fingers traced the spot, he was suddenly violently ejected from his own timeline. The world went silent, then exploded into noise. He wasn't in the vault anymore. He was standing on a crowded street, but the people were moving too fast, blurring like smears of color. Then they moved too slow, their faces contorted in silent, agonizing expressions that lasted for minutes. The sun shot across the sky in seconds, day turning to night in a terrifying strobe light effect. He was experiencing the flow of time at a hyper-accelerated rate. He recognized the faces of people he knew, but they were aging and dissolving before his eyes. Buildings rose and crumbled into dust in the span of a breath. He wasn't moving through space, but through time, and the transition was agony, a cosmic distortion of his molecular structure. A voice, not from his mouth, but echoing from the very structure of the moment, whispered, "You tried to see the current. Now you drown in the river." He snapped back into the vault, collapsing to the cold floor, gasping. The casket was silent and warm, its temperature now strangely elevated. He scrambled back, fleeing the vault, sealing the heavy door behind him, his heart pounding a chaotic rhythm against his ribs. Elias Thorne is still there, locked in his temporal prison. He spends his days staring at the Chronos Casket, waiting. He knows the exact second the security guard will walk by the vault door next. He knows the date of his own death, which is rapidly approaching. And worst of all, he can now constantly hear the collective silent screams of every person whose moment has been lost, every second that has passed, echoing from the metallic box, a monstrous reservoir of stolen time. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a colleague of Dr. Thorne's who found his erratic journal and believes he is no longer living in the same now as the rest of us. Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by The Echo Chamber of Oak Haven. The old Oak Haven Sanitarium stood on a hill overlooking the town, a Gothic monument to decades of human suffering. It had been closed for 50 years, deemed structurally unsound, and more relevantly, psychically contaminated by the local government. Its iron gates were rusted shut, and its stone walls were laced with ivy and shadow. Liam, a former EMT with a morbid fascination for abandoned structures, and his girlfriend, Sarah, a freelance photographer, decided to spend a night documenting the sanitarium's decay for an online urban exploration community. They bypassed the fence and climbed the hill as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in sickly hues of orange and purple. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and something acrid, a phantom scent of antiseptic and fear. The halls were long, dark canyons, lined with peeling paint and institutional green tiles. Everything was still, silent, unnervingly undisturbed. Liam brought a professional-grade audio recorder, hoping to capture the sounds of the wind or perhaps a telltale moan of the old building. He set it up in the main day room, a massive space with barred windows where the patients once gathered. "If this place is haunted," Liam whispered, his voice sounding hollow and too loud, "the ghosts are keeping their mouths shut." Sarah was setting up her camera when she noticed the graffiti. Not the spray-painted tags of teenagers, but decades-old etchings, done crudely with fingernails or blunt objects into the plaster walls. They weren't just names or dates. They were repeating, obsessive phrases. "I am the wall," "the silence screams," and the most common, scratched thousands of times, "They listen." As they moved deeper into the east wing, the unsettling feeling intensified. Liam felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, though there was no draft. Sarah swore she saw a shadow, not a normal one, but a shadow that moved against the light source, sliding up the wall in the corner of her eye. They reached the isolation ward, a row of small stone cells. Liam turned on his recorder, letting it run in the oppressive darkness. They stayed for 10 minutes, exchanging nervous glances, before deciding they had enough atmosphere and headed back to the day room. It was during playback that the true horror began. Liam put on the headphones. At first, it was just the heavy silence of the cell, then their own nervous breathing, then a noise, a sound that was undeniably a human voice, but warped, slow, and guttural, a sound that seemed to be struggling to escape a great depth. It sounded like a woman's cry, but it was stretched out. 1 second of agony took 5 full seconds to play. "Help!" The sound dragged, a low-frequency rumble that vibrated painfully in Liam's eardrums. He ripped the headphones off. "Did you hear that?" Sarah hadn't. It was only on the recording. They decided to leave, a wave of cold dread washing away their curiosity. But as they gathered their gear, Sarah pointed a shaky finger at the wall where Liam had placed the recorder. Next to the old etchings, fresh marks had appeared. They were thin, shallow, and seemed to have been made moments ago. The new inscription read, "We heard you." Panic set in. They ran, their flashlights bouncing wildly off the cracked tile floors. But the sound followed them. Not a physical sound, but something internal, a growing pressure in their ears, a sense that their own thoughts were no longer private. As they reached the main entrance, they heard the first echo. Sarah screamed, but the sound was immediately followed by a louder, distorted version of her own scream, echoing from the darkened corridors behind them. It wasn't just an acoustic echo, it was a perfect, sinister replay. They bolted out the doors, stumbling down the hill, but the echoes chased them. Liam yelled for Sarah to run faster, and his panicked command was immediately followed by a chorus of warped, multi-layered voices repeating, "Rrrr, faster!" They got back to their car and sped away, throwing worried glances in the rearview mirror. They thought they were safe, but the echo chamber of Oak Haven had latched on to them. The next day, Liam was arguing with Sarah about calling the police. He slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "I don't care if you don't believe me." Seconds later, from the empty hallway of their small apartment, the sound came back. "I don't care." The voice was not his own. It was deep, gravelly, and saturated with malevolent patience. The phenomenon escalated. Everything they said, every laugh, every whisper, every argument, every private confession was echoed back to them moments later by the unseen, listening entity. The echoes weren't just sound, they were laced with an emotion that wasn't their own, a cold, observing amusement. Liam and Sarah have since separated, and now communicate only through text. They live in constant fear of their own voices, their own thoughts. They know that every moment they speak, they are feeding the thing in the sanitarium, a thing that records their lives and plays them back, not just to them, but perhaps to others who are silently listening alongside it. The last message Liam sent Sarah was cryptic and terrified. "I heard your childhood lullaby this morning. Where did it get that?" This unsolved mystery was submitted to Watchman Tales by one of our listeners who received a final, frantic voice message containing a distorted, echoing silence. Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by the Fifth Wall Project. In the late 1990s, the U.S. Department of Defense launched a classified program known only as the Fifth Wall Project. The goal was revolutionary and terrifying: to weaponize the human imagination. They weren't looking to create psychic soldiers. They were attempting to create a psychic blind spot, a theoretical fifth-dimensional barrier that could block enemy surveillance, not with concrete, but with sheer, collective psychic noise. The scientists, led by the enigmatic Dr. Alistair Finch, gathered dozens of individuals with exceptional creative minds, acclaimed novelists, avant-garde artists, and architects who specialized in impossible geometry. They were housed in a decommissioned missile silo beneath the Nevada desert, a silent, sterile fortress miles from civilization. The project was based on a simple yet chilling premise. If reality is in part maintained by collective human consciousness, what happens if a small, isolated group is made to believe in an utterly different, non-Euclidean reality? The subjects were exposed to a barrage of sensory manipulation, white noise infused with subliminal whispers, optical illusions designed to break down the perception of depth, and chemical agents that suppress the brain's temporal lobe, the region responsible for stable reality perception. Dr. Finch didn't want them to see things. He wanted them to unsee things, to collectively generate a space that could not exist. For months, nothing happened. The subjects drew impossible sketches, staircases that connected to themselves, doors that opened onto infinite blackness, and structures built of non-parallel lines. The breakthrough and the disaster occurred simultaneously. It started with the architecture. The subjects began to perceive the silo not as a concrete tube, but as a vast, impossible space. They walked down hallways that didn't exist, entered rooms that defied volume, and spoke of a ceiling that was actually a reflection of the floor from a higher dimensional plane. The silo's internal sensors began to fail, registering massive, localized gravity fluctuations and spatial distortions that violated every known law of physics. Then came the fifth wall. The facility's chief security officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, reported seeing a section of the silo's main corridor disappear. Not fade or collapse, but simply vanish, replaced by a visual gap, a space of perfect, absolute blackness that didn't absorb light, but seemed to repel it. It was a blank, dimensionless void, shaped like a doorway. When a brave technician attempted to throw a flashlight into the void, the light source vanished a foot from the opening, but the resulting absence of light on the other side became instantly visible. It was a space where light itself had been cancelled out. Panic broke out. The scientists realized they hadn't just created a blind spot, they had created a dimensional tear, a pocket of reality that was physically mandated by the wills of the subjects, a place where the laws of our universe simply did not apply. The subjects, now totally lost in their induced psychosis, began to worship the void. They called it the silent geometry. They spoke of its peace, its absolute, logical perfection. Dr. Finch ordered the project shut down and the subjects sedated, but it was too late. One novelist, a man named Arthur, walked calmly toward the fifth wall. He turned and smiled at the security team, a look of profound, blissful understanding on his face. He said, "It's not a door. It's the subtraction of a volume." Arthur stepped into the black void. He did not disappear. His body, however, was fundamentally rearranged. He reappeared instantly, stumbling out of the void, but he was no longer three-dimensional. Every part of his body, his arms, his legs, his head, was compressed into a series of impossible angles, his form flattened into a disturbing, two-dimensional silhouette that somehow still had depth. He was a creature of a higher geometry, now trapped in a lower one. He tried to scream, but the sound was thin, like paper tearing. He collapsed, and his body became a series of geometric flaps folding in on themselves. The security team, terrified, opened fire on the fifth wall. The bullets struck the perfect blackness and instantly turned into small, bright, dimensionless discs that fell to the floor, obeying no gravity and reflecting no light. Colonel Hayes initiated the emergency lockdown protocol, sealing the subjects and the scientists in the deep silo. The entire facility was flooded with concrete and subsequently classified as a geological survey site. The Fifth Wall project was erased from all records. But the horror did not stop there.
For months afterwards, people near the decommissioned site reported seeing something impossible, a perfect two-dimensional shadow that walked across the desert floor but had no corresponding object to cast it. It was described as a massive, flattened shape, sometimes human, sometimes alien, following the long, desolate highways at night. And sometimes, when architects and artists stare too long at their blueprints, they hear a sound, a thin, rasping whisper that seems to come from the paper itself, a voice trapped in a lower dimension, begging for the addition of one more axis. The whispers, translated from an impossible language, always contained the same warning: do not try to build the silent geometry. It is a subtraction, and you are the volume to be removed. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a former Department of Defense analyst who found fragments of the project's disaster report concealed within a massive encrypted file titled Project Flatline.
Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by the Subterranean Ticker. Deep beneath the city of London, where the labyrinthine tunnels of the underground meet forgotten Victorian-era sewer systems, a secret known as the Subterranean Ticker is said to reside. It's not a ghost story or a murder mystery. It's a story about a sound. The sound is a low, persistent, rhythmic ticking, like a colossal grandfather clock buried miles deep. It's too slow to be a heartbeat, too deep to be machinery, and too regular to be anything natural. For decades, it was dismissed by engineers and tunnelers as acoustic resonance or minor seismic activity. But the few who spend serious time down in the deepest, most isolated parts of the tunnels, the drainage workers, the utility inspectors, the black market scavengers, know better. They know the ticker is real, and they know what happens to those who try to measure it. Marcus was one such worker, a drainage specialist who was fearless in the face of rat infestations and collapsing masonry. He was utterly paralyzed by the ticker. He had heard it for 10 years, always louder in the unmapped junctions where the air was stagnant and the silence was suffocating. "It's not the sound that gets you," he once told his supervisor, his eyes wide and hollow. "It's the fact that it's counting something." He decided to find out what. Marcus acquired a hypersensitive seismograph, a tool used to measure microtremors, and lowered it into a 200-foot-deep maintenance shaft known as the Well of Whispers, a place where the ticker was said to be deafening. He sealed the shaft and waited. For 3 days, the seismograph recorded only the faint vibrations of the city above. Then, on the 4th night, the needle on the seismograph's drum began to jump wildly, recording a massive, perfect sine wave of energy. The ticker had begun. The sound, Marcus reported in his subsequent frantic journal entries, was a single immense tick. followed by a pause of exactly 43 minutes and 12 seconds, and then the next tock. The regularity was inhuman, cosmic. He spent weeks recording the intervals, but the number was always the same. He began to speculate. The ticker wasn't counting seconds or minutes, it was counting something vast. He theorized it was counting the decay of a fundamental constant, the slow deceleration of the planet's rotation, or perhaps the subtle, gradual dissolution of reality itself. His obsession turned dark. He believed that when the ticker reached zero, when it finished its unknown count, something monumental would occur, something final. The ticker began to affect the physics of the subterranean environment around the shaft. The tunnel walls started to warp, not physically, but perceptually. When Marcus shined his flashlight down the main tunnel, the light seemed to bend toward the source of the ticker, creating bizarre shadows that were too long or too short for their objects. Water dripping from the ceiling would freeze in midair for a fraction of a second before resuming its downward trajectory, as if time itself was hitching on the sound. One afternoon, Marcus found a piece of Victorian ceramic tile near the shaft. He put it in his pocket, intending to clean it later. When he reached the surface, the tile was gone, replaced by a perfectly clean, smooth-edged piece of obsidian, a stone that could not have existed in the London clay. It was as if the ticker was subtly replacing old matter with new, non-local matter in the pause between its sounds. Marcus decided he had to stop it. In a final, desperate act, he descended the Well of Whispers with a powerful shaped charge, military-grade explosives, intending to blast the source of the ticker, whatever it was. His last entry was scribbled violently in the margins of his seismograph log. The ticker is accelerating. The last pause was only 38 minutes. It's almost done. I can't let the count finish. He was never seen again. The police investigation concluded he had simply succumbed to a tunnel collapse. However, the seismograph was recovered. It recorded the detonation, a massive explosion at the bottom of the shaft, but what followed was not silence nor a cave-in. The recording showed that immediately after the blast, the perfect, massive sine wave of the ticker resumed, but now the interval between the tick and the tock was not 43 minutes. It was precisely 43 seconds. Marcus hadn't stopped the ticker. He had made it skip ahead. Now the sound is audible faintly on the very deepest levels of the London Underground, a quiet, insistent tick-tock that many passengers mistake for the squealing of the train's brakes. And the terrible truth is that the ticker is still accelerating, its pace decreasing by a fraction of a second every day. No one knows what happens when the count reaches zero, but the people who work down in the darkness are beginning to hear the pause shrink, and they know with a chilling certainty that the final earth-shattering tock is closer than anyone wants to imagine. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a retired British transport police officer who insists Marcus's file was quietly buried by a government agency specializing in acoustic anomalies. Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by The Dollhouse of the Lost. In the humid, desolate bayou country of Louisiana stands a decrepit mansion known locally as Bellows House. Legend has it that in the 1920s, a wealthy sugar baron commissioned a master craftsman to build a perfect 1/12 scale replica of the entire mansion. Every room, every piece of furniture, every painting. This replica, the Dollhouse of the Lost, was not meant to be a toy, but a monument. When the Baron's young daughter, Eliza, fell ill and died, her inconsolable mother placed the dollhouse in the center of the nursery and sealed the room forever, believing the miniature house would serve as a permanent, safe dwelling for Eliza's spirit. Years later, a pair of paranormal investigators, Alex and Maria, were granted access to the mansion, which was now in the hands of the state and scheduled for demolition. Their target was the sealed nursery. The room was oppressive. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight from a cracked window. In the center, under a sheet that disintegrated when touched, was the dollhouse. It was breathtakingly detailed. Alex peered inside a miniature drawing room and could see tiny, perfectly rendered paintings hanging on the wall, and a tiny carved ivory piano. As they began their initial sweep with thermal cameras and EMF meters, Maria noticed something strange about the dollhouse's grand staircase. The miniature wooden railing was splintered. "That's odd," she whispered, her voice tight. "The house has been sealed for almost a century. Why is the railing broken?" Alex was distracted, staring at a window in the dollhouse's master bedroom. He said, "I think I just saw a tiny flicker of light in there, like a miniature candle being blown out." The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, the air thick with the scent of aged lavender and decaying wood. They started recording. On camera, Alex placed a small silver coin on the floor of the full-size drawing room near the dollhouse. He said, "We'll check it in an hour," establishing a baseline. When they returned, the coin was gone. Maria shone her flashlight into the miniature dollhouse's drawing room. On the tiny, miniature floor rested the full-sized silver coin. It was too large for the room, perched awkwardly on the rug. The scale was completely, impossibly wrong. Alex, pale and sweating, muttered, "The space is bleeding into the model." They decided to leave, but as they backed toward the door, they heard a faint, high-pitched thud from inside the miniature house, followed by a tiny, choking sob. Maria was transfixed by the dollhouse's miniature nursery. She saw a movement. A tiny porcelain figure of a girl, a doll they hadn't noticed before,
was lying on the floor, face down, exactly where the real-life Eliza had died. Then they heard a heavy thud behind them in the real full-sized nursery. They spun around. A large wooden chair that had been pressed against the wall was now lying on its side, as if something huge and heavy had fallen out of it. Alex shone his light on the chair. There, sitting perfectly centered on the seat, was the miniature porcelain girl doll. It was now full-sized, but its texture was unsettlingly smooth, cold, and flawless. The doll's head slowly turned, its eyes painted in a startlingly realistic blue, locked onto Maria. The lips, a perfect painted Cupid's bow, did not move, but a voice, a thin, piping whisper that sounded like a child's voice on an old scratched record, echoed in the room. "You came to play in my house, but you can't go home now. It's time to fit." Terror overcame them. They scrambled out of the nursery, slamming the heavy wooden door shut. They ran through the mansion, the air around them feeling increasingly cramped. When they reached the bottom of the grand staircase, Alex looked up. The ceiling seemed lower, the stairs steeper, the hallway narrower. The mansion was conforming to the scale of the dollhouse. In the ensuing panic, Maria ran down a corridor that seemed to shrink before her eyes. Alex heard her scream, a sound that quickly became muffled and distant, as if she was retreating rapidly into a tiny space. He reached the front door, struggling to turn the massive bronze knob, which suddenly felt enormous. He managed to escape, tearing his way through the overgrown ivy and collapsing on the lawn. Alex was found by local authorities the next morning, curled in a fetal position, muttering nonsensical phrases about scale and volume. He recounts that as he fled, he glanced back at the mansion. The entire house seemed to have shrunk, its windows now tiny, its door a fraction of its former size. It stood there, a perfect 1/12 scale model of Bellows' house, exactly where the dollhouse had been placed in the nursery. The authorities went in, but found only a perfectly preserved miniature replica of the Bellows house sitting on the lawn. The full-sized mansion was gone. They never found Maria. But sometimes, when visitors walk past the property line, they hear a faint, high-pitched sound, a sound like a distant feminine cry, quickly followed by a tiny, mechanical laugh, emanating from the perfect, silent little house, standing alone in the Louisiana sun. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a retired state trooper who was the first on the scene, and who insists a full-size silver coin was found inexplicably lodged in the roof of the miniature house.
Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by The Cursed Binary Stream. In the shadowy corners of the dark web, far beyond the reach of normal search engines, there is a legend of a single continuous digital stream known only by its hexadecimal address. They call it the Cursed Binary. This stream doesn't host files, videos, or forum posts. It is a ceaseless flow of raw data, ones and zeros, that has been transmitting since the early days of the Internet, with no known source, no protocol, and no end. Aidan, a brilliant but deeply unstable computer science student, became obsessed with the stream. He believed it was a communication from an extraterrestrial intelligence, or perhaps the digital echo of a long-dead AI. He spent months building a specialized decoding array, isolating the stream and filtering out the noise. Finally, he managed to write a program that could interpret the raw binary into human-readable characters. The results were chilling. The stream wasn't gibberish. It was a single, coherent narrative, written in perfectly grammatical but profoundly disturbing English. The narrative began innocently enough. The light is fading, but my hands can still feel the keyboard. But it quickly devolved into cosmic horror. The gravity here is a pressure, not a force. It presses against my identity. The ceiling is not a surface, it is an intention. Aidan realized the stream was not fictional. It was a live report. It was the continuous journal of someone who was currently, physically experiencing something horrific, something far beyond our known reality. The narrative described geometric impossibilities, sounds that were colors, and the presence of silent, impossibly massive entities that were looking at the narrator not with eyes, but with a palpable sense of historical curiosity. The narrator's name never appeared, but the account was deeply personal. It contained details only a living, breathing person could know. Descriptions of the narrator's childhood home, the sound of a specific old clock, the name of a first love. Aidan began to notice the account was slightly ahead of his reality. One entry read, "I heard the sound of a car backfiring outside the room where I am, even though I have no ears anymore. The sound was loud, and the man outside swore at the moment it happened." Exactly 30 seconds after he read that, a car backfired loudly outside his apartment window, and he heard a man's exasperated curse. The cursed binary was streaming a reality that was happening to someone, and it was reaching Aidan just milliseconds before the reality reached his world. Aidan tried to respond. He wrote a script to inject a simple message into the network surrounding the stream. He watched the massive flow of ones and zeros, waiting for a reply. The reply came immediately, but not as an injection. The narrative of the stream stopped mid-sentence. The next line began. The question was not a sound, but a sharp, localized ripple in the fabric of this place. The entity that transmitted it must be close to the origin point. The narrator realized they were being read, and that their reader was close to the source of their dimensional imprisonment. The stream became a frantic, terrified conversation, with the narrator begging Aidan for help, providing increasingly complex, impossible instructions on how to locate the stream's physical point of origin.
Aidan spent 3 weeks trying to follow the instructions, which involved not geographic coordinates, but mathematical singularities and non-spatial vectors. The last entry Aidan received was fragmented and desperate. He knows I'm sharing his secrets. He's coming for the antenna. Tell them the stream is not a message. It is a trap, a tether to pull the reader into the text. Then the binary stream went silent for exactly 10 minutes. When it returned, the language changed. It was no longer a first-person account. It was a cold, objective description of a small basement apartment, a flickering monitor, and a young man staring intently at a screen. The final continuous line, which still streams to this day, reads, "The light has faded, but my hands can still feel the keyboard. I am the wall. They listen. The ceiling is not a surface. It is an intention. I am the wall. The silence screams. The gravity here is a pressure, not a force. It presses against my identity. The light is fading," and so on, in an endless loop. The narrative now contains details about Aidan's apartment, his fears, and his life, blending them seamlessly with the original cosmic horror. Aidan is gone. He is not a narrator. He is the text. The cursed binary stream still streams, and every time a dedicated researcher cracks the cipher and begins to read the live feed, the loop subtly shifts, incorporating a new detail, a new location, a new fear. The biography of the latest person to become part of the stream. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a network security consultant who tracked the stream's address to a server that was hosting nothing but a single empty command line interface, now running in an endless loop.
Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by The Curator's Eye. In a quiet wing of the British Museum, concealed from the public, is a vast repository of objects deemed too psychically volatile for display. Among them is a small obsidian sphere called the Curator's Eye. It was recovered from a deep-sea trench off the coast of Iceland, found inside a pressure-welded bronze box that bore no recognizable markings. The eye is about the size of a grapefruit, polished to a mirror shine and utterly cold to the touch. It has no seams, no markings, and defies all attempts at thermal or chemical analysis. Its effect on observers is immediate and unsettling. Anyone who stares into the obsidian for more than a minute experiences a profound, total loss of perspective. They forget what is big and what is small.
Dr. Helena Varma, the museum's leading expert in anomalous artifacts, was the first to study the eye. She initially dismissed the effects as mere optical illusion. She sat in the lab, staring into its glassy depths, and began to speak her observations into a microphone. She said, "The reflection in the sphere is unsettling. It's perfectly flat, but it warps my face in an impossible way, like a hyper-fisheye lens that isn't curved." After 15 minutes, her voice became shaky. I feel like my reflection is larger than the room. My hand, when I move it into the reflection, feels miles away, even though it's only inches from the sphere. When she looked up, the reality of the room seemed to have been scrambled. The lab table looked miles long, its surface impossibly vast. The ceiling seemed to press down on her, the walls looming like cliff faces. She had momentarily forgotten the true scale of her environment. The real terror began when the eye started to teach her new perspectives. Helena found herself perceiving the world in layers of volume she couldn't rationalize. She would look at a piece of wood and see not just the grain, but the internal lattice of cellulose fibers, the vast empty space between the molecules. She looked at her colleague, Dr. Jansen, and saw not a man, but an unfathomably complex, churning cloud of blood, bone, and electrical impulses, vast and frighteningly intricate. The eye was forcing her to perceive the underlying, terrifying scale of things. One day, she was standing on the second-floor balcony overlooking the museum's main hall, and as she gazed down, the eye's lesson kicked in. She saw the museum floor not 50 feet below, but as a continental plain stretching out to an infinite horizon. The small group of tourists below became specks of dust, their bodies microscopic and meaningless. A profound, chilling thought took root. What if the real scale of the universe is much, much larger than we can imagine? And what if, to the truly large entities, we are less than microorganisms? This fear manifested physically. Helena developed a pathological fear of being too big. She refused to eat, convinced that every molecule she added to her body was increasing her volume and drawing the attention of something unimaginably large. She started sleeping in a small cramped supply closet, trying to shrink herself, to become small and insignificant. Her colleagues, alarmed by her rapid decline, tried to reason with her. Dr. Jansen tried to touch her shoulder. She shielded and recoiled. "Don't touch me. You're a colossal fleshy galaxy. Your gravity will tear me apart." One night, the security cameras caught her final, horrifying act. She entered the vault where the curator's eye was stored. She didn't look into it. Instead, she stood before it, holding a small sharpened scalpel. She began to speak to the sphere, her voice a low, terrifying monotone. "It showed me the truth. We are all too vast, too noisy. To escape the outer scale, we must become small. We must subtract the unnecessary volume." The camera recorded the sound of the scalpel being used repeatedly, not to harm others, but to remove small, specific pieces of her own skin, muscle, and flesh. She was attempting to pare down her three-dimensional volume to become less substantial, less visible to the cosmic forces she now perceived. When security finally broke into the vault, she was unconscious. her body mutilated in a geometrically precise way, but still recognizably human. The obsidian sphere sat on the pedestal, perfectly silent, perfectly reflective. Helena Varma is now in a permanent psychiatric facility. She remains completely silent and catatonic except for one terrifying phrase she whispers in her sleep, a phrase that suggests the curator's eye has succeeded not only in changing her perception, but in fundamentally changing her reality. The phrase is, "It is watching. It knows I am less than a dust mite, but a dust mite still casts a large shadow." The British Museum still holds the curator's eye, but it is now encased in lead-lined box and rotated frequently to ensure no one person ever spends more than 10 consecutive minutes in its proximity. But sometimes the cleaning staff working near the sealed vault report hearing a faint, high-pitched scratching sound, as if someone inside is trying to scrape away the internal dimensions of their prison. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a former security guard at the British Museum who was present during the recovery and who still has nightmares about the geometrically carved flesh found in the vault.
Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by the Lighthouse Keeper's Almanac. The Blackwater Lighthouse stood on a treacherous, isolated outcropping far off the Nova Scotia coast. For centuries, it had been a lonely post, but a necessary one, guiding ships away from the shallow, churning reefs. In 1987, the last human keeper, a taciturn man named Silas, vanished without a trace. His final logbook was found open on the desk, its last entry a series of frantic, illegible scrawls. When the Coast Guard investigated, they found the light still turning, the machinery still running, and the kitchen stocked, but Silas was gone. The only anomalous finding was a book hidden beneath his mattress, a century-old leather-bound volume titled The Seaborn Almanac of Celestial Anomalies. This almanac was no ordinary navigational text. It was a cryptic guide to the movements of objects that should not exist, non-Euclidean constellations, transient black holes, and the quiet comets that moved against the laws of orbital mechanics. Silas's new journal entries, found tucked inside the almanac, show a man driven to madness by the light he was sworn to keep. He began by documenting strange occurrences at sea. October 4th, the light flashed, and for a split second the water was not water. It was a sheet of rippling black glass, reflecting a sky full of stars I've never seen. He then began to believe that the lighthouse light itself was not a guide, but a lure, a massive, rotating signal meant to attract things from the dark, silent places between the stars. The almanac contained a horrifying theory that the light needed to be kept burning not for the sake of the ships, but to appease the great navigator, an unseen, interdimensional entity that fed on the sheer energy and focus of the light beam. The great navigator, the Almanac claimed, required a sacrifice, a moment of total, personal, irreversible disorientation. Silas's entries detail his growing fear of the light itself. When the main lamp ignited, the beam seemed to carry more than just light. It carried a strange, high-frequency sound that only he could hear, a sound that whispered impossible mathematical truths into his mind. He wrote about seeing the ships he was meant to guide, but they weren't normal ships. November 19th. Saw the Serafina sail past. It's impossible. That ship sank 50 years ago. Its hull was perfectly intact, but it cast no reflection on the water. The sailors on deck, they were wearing the same rain slickers I saw in the 1930s photo album. They waved, but their faces were stretched like paper masks blowing in a wind that didn't exist. He realized the lighthouse light wasn't just showing him the present. It was illuminating the past, the future, and the terrifying parallel realities that were sailing, unseen, just beyond our perception. He knew he was meant to become the next sacrifice. His final descent into madness involved the mechanism of the light itself. He wrote that the great glass lens of the lighthouse was not just a lens, it was a captured cosmic artifact. It wasn't bending light, it was bending time and space into a narrow, focused beam. In his final frantic scrawl, he documented the end. December 31, 11:59 p.m., the new year. The great navigator demands the disorientation. The light is turning. It's coming for me. I must become the lost one. I must walk the path of the beam. The last shaky line was a single huge capitalized word. Nowhere. When the Coast Guard arrived, they found a strange anomaly at the center of the lens. A tiny, almost invisible etching had been made on the interior surface of the thick glass. It was a perfect, miniature outline of a man, Silas. He had not jumped, nor had he been taken by a boat. Silas had somehow physically entered the focused beam of light and been projected out of reality. The horrifying implication, confirmed by a later secret study of the location, was that Silas was still there. Sometimes, when the beam of the Blackwater Lighthouse sweeps across the empty sea at midnight, passing ships report seeing a momentary flash of a human figure standing right in the center of the light, frozen between a step and a jump. It's only a fraction of a second, but it's enough to suggest that Silas is trapped within the beam itself. A soul caught in a focused, continuous cylinder of bent time, endlessly sailing nowhere. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a maritime historian who found Silas's original, unedited journal buried in the Coast Guard's decommissioned files, marked Exposure to Non-Terrestrial Phenomenon.
Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by The Sentient Sinkhole.
In the middle of a remote, desiccated patch of Australian outback, there is a natural depression in the earth, a perfectly circular, massive sinkhole that locals have long called the throat. It's so deep that no light can reach the bottom and no echo ever returns. Geologists initially dismissed it as a simple karst formation, but its perfection defied natural explanation. The edges were too clean, the descent too smooth. A team of speleologists led by Dr. Evelyn Reed set up a permanent monitoring station near the throat, intending to map its impossible depth using advanced sonar and gravity sensors. The initial sonar readings were what first broke the team's sanity. The sound waves, no matter how powerful, simply ceased to exist at a depth of exactly 5.2 kilometers. The sensors registered a perfect, sudden silence. But the gravity sensors began to behave erratically. They registered a gravitational pull emanating not from the bottom of the pit, but from the sides, and not downward, but inward, toward a non-existent center mass. Dr. Reed became convinced that the throat was not a geological feature. It was a massive, living entity that was slowly, patiently consuming the earth around it. One evening, as the sun set over the desolate scrubland, the silence around the throat was shattered. A low, wet, rhythmic, sucking sound began to emanate from the depths. It wasn't a wind tunnel or water. It was the sound of something unimaginably vast inhaling. The team watched in horror as the sand, dust, and small rocks around the rim began to slide inward, drawn not by gravity, but by the sonic vibration of the inhalation. They tried to communicate with it. They lowered a massive industrial-grade speaker and played a pure 440 Hz sine wave, the universal tuning pitch. The pit went silent for 5 minutes. Then, from the absolute blackness, a sound returned. It was the same 440 Hz tone, but now warped, distorted, and layered with a sickening biological undertone. It was the sound of the pit mimicking the tone. It was a confirmation that the entity had heard them. The terror peaked when Dr. Reed's colleague Ben walked too close to the edge. He was holding a metal clipboard. As the pit let out another long, low suck, the clipboard was violently ripped from his hand, pulled not downward, but sideways into the void, vanishing instantly. The pit was reacting to specific objects. Dr. Reed's journal theorized, "It is not eating, it is curating. It is absorbing matter that holds unique energetic signature, pulling it into a non-spatial pocket within the earth. It is a collector." They packed up to leave, the fear now a tangible physical weight in the air. As they started their truck, the speakers they had left by the pit's edge suddenly came to life. They were broadcasting a sound, a human voice, recognizable as Ben's. It was a recording of Ben's first excited observation of the throat from a week prior. "The sheer size of this thing is mind-blowing. Imagine the gravity down there. It's perfect." But the recording was spliced. After Ben's voice, a deep, resonating, wet rumble followed, the sound of the pit responding. The sound was not an echo. It was a sample. The pit was repeating Ben's exact tone and intonation, followed by a low, guttural, satisfied gurgle. They fled the site in terror. The entity in the throat is still there.
It is said that whenever a new piece of technology, a new artifact, or an animal with a unique genetic code comes within a few hundred yards of the throat, the low, wet suck can be heard. The object is gone instantly. The ultimate horror is not what the pit is eating, but what it is doing with what it collects. Local ranchers sometimes find strange, impossible objects lying near the edge. A perfectly preserved 18th century porcelain doll, a shard of metal from a spacecraft that hasn't been launched yet, or a photograph of a person who has not yet been born. The entity is collecting and organizing its treasures in a dimension we cannot perceive, using the throat as its silent, consuming aperture. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, the low, sated gurgle can be heard, followed by a faint, ghostly whisper, a collection of all the voices it has absorbed over the millennia, all speaking the same, single, chilling word: mine. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a former geologist on the team, who now refuses to own anything made of metal for fear it will be consumed by the subterranean entity.
Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by The Mirror of Total Recall. A small antique shop in Prague acquired a full-length, late Baroque mirror in a gilded frame. The mirror had no specific history, but it had a distinct, unsettling quality. When you looked into it, your reflection was too clear, too detailed, too alive. A young art student named Jana bought the mirror, thrilled by its craftsmanship. She hung it in her small apartment, believing it would inspire her. The inspiration came, but it was horrifying. The mirror wasn't just reflecting her present self, it was reflecting every single version of her she had ever been, all at once. When she looked in the mirror, she saw her current self, but overlaid with a terrifying collage of her past. She could see the faint outline of the 5-year-old version of herself peering over her shoulder, the acne-scarred teenager frowning beneath her chin, and the tear-streaked face of her 20-year-old self from a devastating breakup, all layered, translucent, and shifting. The effect was initially fascinating. She felt she could access perfect, total memory. She could glance at the reflection of her 10-year-old self and instantly recall the specific sound of the cartoon theme song she was listening to that day, the exact scent of the rain, the precise texture of the carpet. The mirror of total recall gave her access to every sensation, every moment, every terrifying mistake she had ever made. But the memories were not just her own. As she spent more time with the mirror, the reflections began to extend beyond her own lifetime. She started seeing faces that weren't hers, flickering, ancient faces overlaid on her own, speaking silent, desperate languages. She saw the reflection of a 19th century man in a uniform, then a woman in a medieval wimple, then a figure that was barely human, covered in moss and mud, staring out with wild, frightened eyes. The mirror was not only reflecting her personal history, it was reflecting the history of the space where the mirror hung, a terrifying composite of everyone who had ever stood in that exact spot in the apartment's long history. The true horror began when the past selves started to communicate. Yana looked into the mirror and saw the reflection of herself from 2 days ago, a reflection that was smiling faintly. This past Yana then subtly raised one hand, a gesture that the current Yana did not make. The past self was acting independently. The past selves wanted out. The reflection of her 6-year-old self began to cry, but the tears ran down the mirror's surface in the real world, leaving faint, shimmering trails of moisture. Then the ancient non-human entity started to gesture wildly. Yana felt a violent splitting headache as a cacophony of sensations flooded her mind. The smell of ancient burning wood, the sound of a Roman legion marching, and the taste of metallic blood. The mirror was trying to offload its memories into her. It was attempting to swap realities. In a final, terrifying moment, Yana stood before the mirror and saw the reflection of a future self, an elderly skeletal woman with dead eyes and a long white gown, staring back. This future self did not look distressed. It looked expectant. The future self lifted a hand and reached through the mirror. Yana felt a cold, skeletal grip clamp around her wrist. The touch was agonizing, filled with the pain of an entire lifetime lived and lost. She screamed and pulled away, falling backwards onto the floor. When she looked up, the mirror was dark and opaque, like a sheet of pure black ice. Yana smashed the mirror with a hammer, shattering the glass into a million jagged pieces. The shards were later collected by the police, who were investigating a noise complaint. Yana was found curled in a corner, her eyes wide with terror, mumbling a strange dialect that no one could identify. The horror is that the mirror of total recall never gave her the memories. It took them. Yana now lives in a silent white room. She has no memory of her own life. She doesn't know her name, her age, or who her parents are. But she still has the memory of the ancient, non-human entity, a creature that smells of mud and fear, a creature that lived in the exact spot of her apartment 3,000 years ago. And sometimes, when a nurse walks into her room, Yana opens her mouth, and a voice that is not hers, a guttural, terrifying voice from the dawn of humanity, speaks one single chilling sentence. I remember the cold, and I remember your fear. It is a perfect memory. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by an elderly police officer who collected the mirror shards and later became convinced that his own memory was now incomplete.
Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by the Hyperacoustic Artifact.
A team of rogue archaeologists discovered a massive bell-shaped bronze artifact buried in a recently thawed area of the Siberian tundra. The artifact, which they nicknamed the tuning fork of the void, was too large to move and weighed over a ton. It was covered in intricate, non-repeating geometric symbols that seemed to defy the conventions of any known human civilization. Dr. Anya Petrova, the team's linguist, theorized the symbols were not writing, but a complex visual representation of sound, a score for a piece of music. The team decided to attempt to play the score. They constructed a massive pneumatic hammer designed to strike the bronze at the precise points indicated by the symbols. The first sound was not music. It was a single, immense, sustained vibration that resonated not only through the ground, but through the human body. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The sound wave did not just travel through the air. It traveled through the bone, the nervous system, and the mind, bypassing the eardrum entirely. Anya and the team collapsed, writhing on the frozen ground. The sound was not painful.
Which of
it
these
was
stories
compelling.
gave you chills
It spoke
tonight?
directly to the
Let
base
us know
instincts,
in the
the
comments.
precognitive,
And
animal
remember,
parts of the
don't
human
forget
brain.
to like, share,
When they
and
recovered,
subscribe
the team was
to Watchman
fundamentally
Tales,
changed.
or
They spoke
something
in low,
may be
guttural
watching
voices,
you
and they looked
right
at the
now.
world with a disturbing
Sleep
lack
well,
of recognition, as if
you
they were
can.
seeing reality for the first time and finding it repulsive. They became obsessed with the artifact. They spent days playing the score, each strike of the hammer releasing a new, terrifying note that restructured their perception of reality. The sounds warped the environment. The light in the sky began to bend, creating shimmering, impossible colors. The air thickened, and a strange metallic scent filled their nostrils. One archaeologist, Ivan, described the effect in his shaky journal. The sound does not enter the ear. It enters the consciousness and rebuilds the room. When the last strike hit, I saw the ceiling. But the ceiling was not wood. It was an infinitely complex, spinning clockwork mechanism made of light, and I could hear the grinding of its gears. I am no longer in the cabin. I am inside the clock. The team realized the artifact was not a bell. It was a tuning fork, and it was tuning the local environment, changing the fundamental constants of physics within its radius. The final catastrophic sound came on the fifth night. The team struck the key note, the central symbol on the artifact. The sound was not loud. It was total. It was a sustained, silent bass frequency that vibrated the molecules of the human body. Anya saw her colleague Ben standing a few feet away. But Ben was no longer Ben. He was a creature of pure, raw biological function, a perfectly visible, pulsating network of nerves, blood vessels, and bone, held together by a thin, collapsing sheath of skin. He looked like an anatomical diagram that was screaming silently. Ben screamed and clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound was internal.
He fell, his body dissolving not through decay, but through a kind of sonic disintegration, his molecules vibrating past the point of structural integrity. Anya fled the site, driven by a primal, non-human urge to survive. She ran for days across the tundra, her mind saturated with the silent frequency of the artifact. She was found by a local hunter miles from the site, suffering from advanced hypothermia and a complete inability to speak. Anya is now in a medical facility, but she is not catatonic. She is intensely active. She spends her days covering the walls of her room with an intricate, repeating pattern of symbols. They are not the symbols from the artifact, but they are clearly related. When asked what she is doing, she doesn't speak. She hums a low, silent, resonant frequency from her chest. A linguist finally decoded her symbols. They are a score, a piece of music. And the title of the score, repeated in a silent, maddening loop, is The Anti-Song, a score for the reassembly of man. The horrifying truth is that the hyperacoustic artifact did not just change her perception, it changed her fundamental makeup. It disassembled her reality and is now attempting to reassemble her into the non-human form dictated by the Arctic score. And the facility she is in is beginning to subtly resonate with her low, constant hum, a silent vibration that affects the metal in the walls and the sanity of the staff. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a Russian scientific journalist who noticed the strange repeating metal fatigue patterns in the facility where Anya is housed.
Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by The Architect's Recursion. Elias Vance was a celebrated architect known for his obsession with impossible geometry and non-linear space. His final, unfinished project was a private residence in the hills of Northern California, a structure he called the Mobius House. It wasn't just non-Euclidean. It was designed to induce a sense of subtle, constant, recursive disorientation in its inhabitants. Elias lived alone in the finished basement while he worked on the rest of the house. His notes, discovered after his disappearance, documented a mind being slowly unraveled by his own creation. He wrote about a single repeating hallway on the main floor. I walk the length of the western corridor. It is 50 feet. I turn around and walk back. It is now 62 feet. The corridor does not lengthen physically. It lengthens perceptually. The space is absorbing distance. The house was not the static structure. It was a living calculation, a massive, recursive algorithm made of concrete and glass. The terror began when the house started to change not just its geometry, but its history. He would walk into a room and notice an object that shouldn't be there. A half-empty bottle of wine he hadn't bought, a newspaper from 1957, a faint burn mark on a wooden floor that had only been laid the previous week. He realized the house was subtly incorporating objects and moments from its own possible futures and alternate pasts. It was folding different timelines into its physical structure. One night, he was in the kitchen when he heard a noise from upstairs. He ran up the stairs to investigate. The upstairs hallway was empty, but when he walked back down, the front door was ajar, and a pair of muddy boots he didn't own were sitting neatly by the entrance. He went outside to check for intruders. The grounds were empty. When he returned inside, the boots were gone. But sitting on the kitchen counter was a small, crudely written note. "We checked. The loop is clean." The most terrifying feature of the Mobius house was the concept of the eternal staircase. Elias designed a simple flight of stairs leading from the main hall to the second floor. He noted that every time he walked up it, he would experience a brief moment of total disorientation at the third step, a feeling of being briefly untethered from time. One morning he woke up in the main hall. He had no memory of descending the stairs. He tried to walk up to his workspace on the second floor. He began the climb, but the staircase didn't end. He walked past the landing, then continued to walk past a turn, and then another turn, realizing with cold dread that he was walking through a perfectly continuous, self-referential loop of a staircase. He was climbing endlessly, trapped in an architectural paradox. He descended in panic, running back to the main hall, only to find that the entire lower level had changed. The front door was no longer there. The room was sealed, the walls smooth, unbroken concrete. Elias Vance was trapped in his own recursive creation. His final entry, scrawled on the back of a blueprint, showed his ultimate understanding. The house is not built, it is being calculated, and I am the variable that makes the loop possible. The house cannot exist without me running in its circles. He concluded that the only way to stop the calculation was to remove the variable. The police investigation found the house eerily silent and structurally sound. They found no Elias, no blood, and no signs of forced entry. The house was locked from the inside. However, they noted one peculiar architectural detail. A new wall had been constructed in the basement. It was a perfectly smooth, unpainted concrete wall that shouldn't have been there. When the demolition team finally removed the wall, they found only a massive, hollow space filled with concrete dust. But imprinted on the inside of the wall, where a human body might press, was a perfect, flattened, three-dimensional indentation of a man, Elias Vance. He was pressing his hands against the concrete in a final, desperate push. And on the floor, etched into the foundational slab was a single repeating phrase, written in his own hand in a continuous, endless loop, circling the indentation. The loop is clean. The loop is clean. The loop is clean. The loop is clean. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a foreman on the demolition crew who insists he saw the faint outline of a pair of muddy boots in the dust near the indentation.
Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by The Vanishing Point Map. In a dusty Parisian library, a cartographer named Alistair unearthed an incredibly detailed map titled The Cartographia of the Vanishing Points. It was old, hand-drawn on vellum, and covered in strange, non-geographic markings. The map showed the city of Paris, but instead of marking streets and landmarks, it marked specific, single points on the ground with a tiny, stylized symbol, a perfect, empty circle. The title on the legend explained these circles as vanishing points. Alistair realized the map was not about place, but about absence. He became obsessed. He located the first marked vanishing point, an empty, nondescript patch of pavement near the Seine River. The pavement looked normal, but when he stood on the exact spot, he felt an immediate, profound sense of disconnection. The noise of the city seemed muted, and the people around him looked distant, like figures in a photograph. He theorized that the vanishing points were small, localized anomalies, places where reality had momentarily collapsed or a spatial volume had been permanently subtracted. He began to walk the path of the map, visiting point after point. The effects grew stronger. At the fifth point, he lost his sense of gravity for a fraction of a second, stumbling as if the downward pull had momentarily vanished. At the 10th point, a small black cat walked directly over the spot, and in the middle of the point, the cat simply ceased to exist. It didn't teleport or vanish in a flash of light. It was just gone, the space where it was now completely empty. Alistair panicked, but the scholarly obsession was too strong. He spent a week trying to prove his theory. He would drop small objects, a pencil, a coin, a handkerchief. Every time, the object would instantly disappear. There was no trace of them, no sound of them falling. Only the chilling certainty of their absence. He realized the vanishing points were not just points of absence, they were apertures. They were collecting things, drawing objects into a non-spatial pocket the way a small black hole might collect matter. But the horror was that the vanishing points were not static. The map was drawn on a thin, almost translucent paper, and as he studied it under lamplight, he noticed the tiny circles were beginning to shift. They were migrating, moving slightly along the streets, their positions changing slowly over time. He calculated the speed. The vanishing points were moving toward the center of the map, the Louvre Museum. Alistair, terrified that the map was leading to a massive central collapse, rushed to the Louvre, the map clutched in his trembling hands. He found the central vanishing point in the museum's main courtyard, a large marble slab. As he approached, he saw a crowd of tourists gathered around a massive sculpture. And then the sculpture vanished. It was a priceless 17th-century bronze fountain, hundreds of gallons of water, tons of bronze. It didn't explode or shatter. The volume of the fountain was simply subtracted from reality, leaving only a large, circular, empty space on the marble slab where it had stood. The tourists screamed, but the panic was short-lived. A moment later, they all looked around confused and began to ask, "Why are we looking at an empty slab? Was there something here?" The memory of the fountain had been subtracted along with the object. The vanishing point had consumed the object and the localized reality that supported it. Alistair, realizing the existential danger, tried to warn the security guards. He screamed, pointing at the map, but the guards looked at him with cold, empty eyes. One of them pointed to the map in Alistair's hand. "Sir, why are you holding an empty piece of old parchment? There are no markings on it." The map, now completely empty of its dark circles, had finished its work. It had successfully integrated all its vanishing points into a single, massive aperture at the Louvre. The final horror for Alistair was the realization that he was standing on the aperture. He looked down at his shoes, then his legs, and watched as his own form began to blur and become translucent, the subtle effect of being unwilled by the space around him. The police found Alistair's empty clothing neatly folded in the courtyard. Inside the pocket was a perfectly empty piece of vellum. But sometimes, when a guard walks through the Louvre courtyard at night, they hear a sound, a faint, scholarly whisper that seems to come from the marble slab. It is Alistair's voice, not in words, but in a desperate, rapid sequence of calculations. -1 volume, -1 mass, -1 memory. The vanishing point is still there, patiently waiting. And every once in a while, a piece of the Louvre or a piece of a tourist simply ceases to exist, making the total volume of reality fractionally smaller. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a former security officer at the Louvre, who swears he remembers a magnificent bronze fountain that everyone else insists never existed.
Now, let's move to the next story, which was sent to us by The Chronometer of the Lost Hour. Dr. Julian Harker, a meticulous horologist, purchased a massive antique pendulum clock from a private auction. The clock was a museum piece, ornate, mahogany, with a deep, sonorous chime. The only unusual detail was that the face had only 11 hour markers. The number 12 was absent, replaced by a dark, perfectly smooth patch of polished wood. Julian was fascinated. He spent days calibrating the clock. It kept perfect time, marking the minutes and seconds with flawless precision.
But when the long hand swept past the 11 and approached the spot where the 12 should be, a terrifying phenomenon occurred. The clock did not chime for the hour of 12. Instead, at the moment the hands crossed the spot, the entire room went silent. Not just acoustically silent. The silence was absolute. The background hum of the refrigerator, the distant sirens, the sound of Julian's own breathing, all ceased. The second hand of his digital wristwatch stopped. Everything paused. The pause lasted for exactly 1 hour of subjective time, but when the clock's hands reappeared on the 1 o'clock marker, only a single second had passed in the real world. The clock was creating a lost hour, a localized private hour of subjective time that existed only in the clock's immediate vicinity. Julian, thrilled and terrified, began to spend the lost hour experimenting. He learned that inside the lost hour, the laws of physics were subtly warped. He could push a heavy object, and it would move with impossible ease, as if it had lost 90% of its mass. He could stare at a complicated diagram, and the knowledge would absorb into his mind instantly. The lost hour was a place of extreme temporal acceleration, a brief, private paradise for the mind. But the lost hour was not empty. During the 3rd week, as the hands approached the 12, Julian felt a chill. When the silence hit, he looked up and saw that he was not alone. Standing in the corner of the room was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in a heavy black floor-length cloak. It was not moving. It was simply standing there, observing him with a profound, terrifying stillness. The figure had no face. Where the head should be, there was only the same dark, polished wood as the clock face, a smooth, empty void. Julian realized the figure was the keeper of the lost hour. The next time the silence hit, Julian found the figure closer. It was now standing next to the clock, its dark wooden face turned toward the pendulum. In a moment of cold, scholarly terror, Julian knew what the figure was doing. It was waiting for a time to be lost so that it could exist. It was a creature born of the temporal void. Julian tried to smash the clock, but inside the lost hour, his body was moving in the warped time. His movements were slow, ponderous, like struggling through treacle. The keeper, however, was moving at a terrifying, natural pace, its long, cloaked hand reaching out. The keeper did not try to harm him. It was simply trying to claim him. The cloaked hand reached out and touched Julian's arm. Julian felt an agonizing sense of deletion, a feeling that his entire life was being wiped from a cosmic ledger. He screamed, but the sound was trapped in the warped time, stretching into a low, silent bass note. He was saved only by the clock's exit from the void. At the instant the hands struck the 1 o'clock marker, the silence snapped, the background noise returned, and the keeper was gone.
Julian was found days later, huddled in the corner. He had severe temporal dissociation. He believed he was still living in the lost hour. He was right. The Keeper had marked him. Julian now lives in a permanent state of temporal decay. His hair is graying rapidly. His skin is slackening. He is aging months for every week that passes. The Keeper is consuming his lifetime, one accelerated moment at a time. He knows the final horror. When his lifespan is finally consumed, the Keeper will not just take his life, it will take his memory from the world. He will become the lost man, a person whose life existed but whose memory has been entirely subtracted. Julian Harker is now in a hospice, clinging to the last fading moments of his chronological life. He spends his days staring at the empty wall, but sometimes, when the shadows lengthen, he whispers a final terrifying warning to the nurses. Don't look at the clock. It is waiting for the next hour to be lost, and it will claim the next Keeper. This story was shared with Watchman Tales by a physician at the hospice who noticed that every time Julian's condition worsened, a new tiny scratch mark would appear on the polished wood of his grandfather clock, which is now an exhibit in a museum. Which of these stories gave you chills tonight? Let us know in the comments, and remember, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Watchman Tales, or something may be watching you right now. Sleep well.